Welcome to FO Talks. I'm Peter Isackson, Fair Observer's Chief Strategy Officer. Today I'm joined by Flavius Mihaies, an investigative journalist and regular contributor to Fair Observer who has covered multiple conflict zones. His journalism primarily focuses on themes related to conflict, the experience of minorities in times of war, and the effects of economic sanctions, otherwise known as economic warfare. With the arrival of Donald Trump at the White House a month and a half ago, I think everyone agrees that the entire political and psychological landscape of Europe, which was formerly known for its pacifism or its ability to conduct its affairs peacefully, it suddenly changed. And now we're suddenly talking about war. Flavius, how do you see things? How are they evolving now? What's going on? Where is this going to take us?
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be back in conversation with the Fair Observer. Indeed, there is a blitzkrieg of declarations and diplomatic actions over the last month or so. And as you mentioned, lately France has been quite vocal in its declarations vis-à-vis the future of the war and how it sees the war in Ukraine evolving. From the perspective of from the perch here in Washington, there is little illusions that France and some European country, because it's not even the EU as a whole that have made the latest declarations, but handpick or select number of countries, one of which is obviously not in the European Union anymore, the UK. There is little illusion that Europe will be able to step in and replace American role in supporting the Ukrainians in their fights against Russia. And I think that was perhaps somehow well illustrated by President Trump last week, who said in reference to NATO and Article 5, would the French come and help us if America was in trouble?
Yes. Well, they did that 250 years ago with Lafayette.
Let's not forget that they did indeed. So it's a
little bit of a gap. Some people's memory. But yes, as you were saying, what we're seeing, at least on the European side, is that you almost have Starmer in the UK and Macron vying for leadership of something that is very difficult to define, which is the European position and the European stance and action or action plan that they intend to make once they understand whether the US is an ally or not. So I don't know how people are talking about it in Washington, but the conversation here is US an ally of Europe, and which Europe is it an ally of, by the way? And is there something that Europe can do to replace the US if the US is moving away? How are people talking about that in Washington?
Well, Americans are very practical and short-term oriented, and so the conversation is naturally on what's next with the conflict in Ukraine. And here you have the positions that is certainly since the beginning of the Trump administration at odds with Europe, for the very simple reason that while the Ukraine conflict is a European war, it's not Trump war. And Trump can say, well, I didn't start that war. And as he likes to state many times over and over, it would not have started under my administration. And by the way, I did win the election in 2020. So it's not Trump war, and he can distance himself, and he has been doing that actively, while the European leaders are very, very much involved and have a personal stake into this war.
But that's interesting what you say, and everyone notices that Trump says it's not my war, but he wouldn't have done it. It wouldn't have happened if he had been president. So at some point you get the impression that he's saying it's Biden's war, but At other times, you have the impression that it's the U.S. deep states war, and none of that is clear. And that's I think has led to a lot of ambiguity in the way even the media report on it. So whose war is it? Who can take responsibility for it? And what does it mean to negotiate, to be in a position to negotiate in terms of who is an active participant? Because it's a proxy war. So how do we sort out all these crazy threads?
You're absolutely right. It's a proxy war, and it's the first time the U.S. Clearly stated so. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said so last week or less than 2 weeks ago that this is a proxy war. Which, if you had said that only a month earlier, you would have been labeled as a pro-Putin, or you would have been, your YouTube account or X account would have been deleted or banned. Just saying that. So that's a big change indeed for in the U.S. position, and it fits with President Trump stance in and policy and election program. Excuse me, where you can say he was elected on the mandate to end the war in Ukraine, certainly to focus on domestic issues, and Ukraine is a distraction from that. It's a distraction also from the pivot to Asia, which started way before Trump under President Obama. So Ukraine is a distraction that needs to be resolved in the Trump world, in the Trump view of the world. And so I think there is a confusion also in Europe looking at and even within the opposition in America, looking at Trump diplomatic action as a friend of Putin or pro-Putin. It's not so much that Trump is pro-Putin as that it's a nuisance. It's a waste of money. Coming from a business perspective, it's a black hole. I don't get much from it. For his foreign policy team, it's a reverse Kissinger that they would like to do, is to get to separate Russia from China so they can better focus on containing China. So all that to say that you have a new administrations that come with a radically different view of the world, that is more transactional and also more looking at where is our money best invested, and Ukraine has not been. There is no illusions that in America that what the Europeans could not achieve with the help of America, they would not be able to achieve without America. So therefore, the solution is at the negotiation table. And we've seen that over the last few weeks, Trump pushing for that in that directions.
Yes, but when you talk about negotiations, then you have a new problem, which the Europeans have highlighted, and that is they're saying this is a European war. We are concerned, but nobody's invited us to the negotiation table, so we have to be there. And curiously, and I'm just describing what I have to see going on around me, curiously, that was the initial reaction to Trump's idea of going straight into talks with Russia, but that quickly modulated into, we don't only want to be at the negotiation table, we want to continue the war. And it isn't clear to me how that logic works, why you say, well, if we haven't been invited to the negotiation table, then it means we are engaged in a war. And that's a way of admitting that not only is it a proxy war between the US and Russia, but now it's a proxy war between Europe and Russia. And that's a different thing. And how do Americans react to that? Other than what we can say about Trump saying, well, yeah, take the war and live with it if that's what you want. We're out. But the Europeans then have to say, okay, we're in. And I don't believe that they can actually say that.
Absolutely. The contention, just to take a step back, the contention that Europe was not at a negotiation table is also can be interpreted in a different way. From here, the talks between Russia and America, which began in Riyadh 2 weeks ago, is not a negotiation. It's actually a reestablishment of direct communication between the Russian and American governments, which itself is a preconditions for any negotiation.
Exactly.
So also in terms of what happened in Riyadh, which is that first high-level public summit between the conversation meeting between the American and the Russian governments, is actually not itself the negotiation, but the precondition to the negotiation, which is opening a direct conversation. So again, also the Europeans were a bit off mark on this, Ukrainians as well, and so it makes sense why. Also, it's understandable why Europe would not be there. But if you add to that, as you just mentioned, Peter, very, 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 very well, that perhaps Europe is not invited to the negotiation table because it does not want to end the war. So the blame is on Europe from the American perspective, not on America, and it's hard to see how Europe would be credible both with America, given its lack of capabilities, and also with Russia, which I think there was enough commentaries in the French and Russian media about President Putin's latest snarky comments comparing Macron to Napoleon in terms of the outcome of a French military involvement against Russia. But I think there is also perhaps the reluctance, the caution in America that the peace plan by Starmer and Macron, which involves sending 50,000 peacekeeping soldiers in Ukraine, really is a ploy to get America to intervene with a fait accompli, because we know that those 50K soldiers, first, if you can actually mobilize them, which is a big if. France has an army of 120,000 personnel. Only about half of them are deployable. The UK military can be contained into a soccer stadium. It's
70,000. 70,000.
Exactly. And only half of them, if you take the cooks and the hairdresser and others, paramedics out, it's only about half. So when Russia army size has tripled since February 2022, the beginning of the invasion, to over 1 million of active duty personnel. So this troop will be wiped out pretty quickly on 2,000 kilometers front line. And then they would automatically bring the US in. And there is that concern that we have in Europe, there is bellicose, and that will ultimately, that peace plan, quote unquote, will actually be a ploy to bring the American in when those, if at all, mobilized force would be destroyed by Russia.
But isn't this an academic debate, which makes me think that it's a phony debate? But isn't it academic in the sense that it's very clear that the Russians would not allow NATO forces or anything that could be interpreted as NATO forces, even if they're called peacekeeping forces. And even, I would suppose, if they had the authorization of the Security Council, which may or may not happen. But I think it's clear that Russia would not allow that. That the whole point of the war, from Russia's point of view, is that having NATO troops of any kind in Ukraine was an existential threat. That's certainly the thesis defended by people like John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs. So if that's true, and if at the same time we accept that what most people say is that Russia is in a position of strength militarily within Ukraine, how can you debate such things as if they were serious objects of debate?
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. When you have a serious look at the facts and the capabilities, it doesn't make much sense. In other words, these are European leaders, because again, this is not an EU policy. This is a handpick, a select group of EU members and non-EU members. Doesn't have the capability for its policies. And I think that and another aspect to it, which makes so far the European, or the group of European countries a dubious, is that Starmer and Macron will talk about ceasefire, but Russia already said there would not be ceasefire. So they are putting the cart before the horse by saying we're going to send peace keepers, but they will be peace enforcers, so attack troops, not peacekeeping, because Russia said there is no ceasefire. Russia said so you're talking about a scenario, imaginary scenario, where you are assuming the positions from Russia that he clearly said it would not have, in a context where Russia is winning on the battleground. So it makes that even more of a fantasy. And then from Washington perspective, you wonder why you're not taken seriously. Well, you look at your capability, look at what you've not been able to achieve with the American, look at your construct of a ceasefire, which again is unrealistic or doesn't take into consideration Russia at all. I mean, ceasefire is two sides. At no point in those discourse you have a mention of what Russia wants, what Russia does, or what Russia would want. And this is the first time I hear conversation about the ceasefire, perhaps, not perhaps, it's the first time I hear conversation about ceasefire where there's only one party that is being discussed and not two parties. So it's veer on the absurd, and that crash against the wall of the Trump very practical, clearly defined view of the world and positions to end the conflict.
Yeah, what occurs to me is that, what troubles me, I would say, is that we see people taking very strong positions. I mean, when I say strong positions, Macron is saying we need to convert to a war economy, that is France itself, and we need to convert Europe into a war economy, and he's not alone, but he's not, there is no unanimity, and far from it. There isn't even unanimity amongst the French people that they would assent to a policy that actually implied going to war with Ukraine. And there's much debate about it. Just, today, if you listen to the French media, people are talking about it. Would we accept that? Should there be a consultation, they say, a referendum on the war? But all this seems to me a bit silly. It really does. Honestly, that's my position. So I wonder, what is the motivation of people like Macron and Starmer who are taking strong positions? Is it personal? Is it a question of defining their own political position in Europe? But at the same time, is there a strategy? Because the personal strategy is always a factor that you have to take into account in political decision making. Trump is the perfect example of that. But is there some strategic orientation that we need to take seriously, which is the construction of a militarized Europe, but a unified militarized Europe, which seems to be what a lot of people want, but is it possible?
Absolutely. There are many roadblocks that already are emerging on the collective European defense of up to or of 800 billion.
Yes, that's Ursula von der Leyen's figure. She copied from the Pentagon.
Interesting. I'm not surprised that the Europeans are copying things and not coming up with their own lately. But first, so far it's a statement of declaration of intention. It has to be passed within the legislation of European countries, and I think it might even be the European Parliament. It's not been so far, so it's a statement of intent and intention. Sorry. Then, when you look at the division, as you mentioned, there is opposition within France. The opposition party, the right party, Rassemblement National, the Le Pen party, immediately opposed the agenda, saying, well, we for very legitimate reason, you may say, well, let's start buying European military hardware. Why are the Poles and the Germans buying and the Baltic states buying American warplanes and not French warplanes, Rafale? So you have to resolve that, which can take time and be a huge headache. And the Americans are, of course, not interested in having the Europeans buying European hardwares if they can buy American hardwares. So that's already an enormous roadblock. Then you have the declaration of President Macron in his speech to the nation last week saying, well, we are willing to extend the nuclear umbrella because France with the UK are the only two European countries with nuclear capability. Well, the UK depend entirely on, or depend in large part to the US, so that's out of the equation.
Oh, formally, they cannot operate without the US. Yeah.
Okay, so that's out of the equation already. And then there is already opposition in France that, you know, why would we share the decision making on that strategic, you know, existential protections with other countries with whom we've been at war for the last century twice. Do we actually want to share that with other countries who, you know, the marriage might not last, many marriages do not last. And it's already difficult. It's already a difficult decisions in terms of nuclear doctrine, national doctrine to come up with when and when not to use the nuclear weapon. Imagine when you have 30 plus countries, how are you going to come up with the decision when to use the nuclear weapon? So it seems like a nice statement. It's perhaps like a nice statement, but it doesn't have much real, you know, implication in reality so far.
Yeah. In order to get his point across, Macron has attempted to make people believe that the Russians are ready to invade the Champs-Élysées, which the French people, as far as I can see, do not find very credible. So that's another part of it is you can make all these statements, you can have all this seemingly coherent strategy that appeals to the idea that if everyone works together and collaborates and Europe becomes something that's really cooperative, all these things are possible. But at the same time, the reality, which is apparent to everyone who looks at it, I mean, I'm talking about Europeans who are looking at their own situation, is that it makes no sense. So what's going to happen to a continent where all the leaders are confused about what they actually can do and how their plans can be perceived, and the people themselves have not expressed themselves and have no means of expressing themselves with regard to a situation that has dramatically changed with the arrival of Trump and everything like that. What do you make personally of this state of confusion? How long can it last? What can come out of it? And then how is it perceived in the US, both at the official level of diplomatic relations with their allies and at the man in the street level?
Yeah, I think the state of confusion is an important observation. And it's in part driven by the different agenda here. For President Macron, it's a question of political survival, political relevancy first, and political future after his mandate is over. You now have internally what we call cohabitation, where you have a prime minister and the president who are from different parties. And so practically, President Macron doesn't have a say into managing French domestic affairs. So what's left for him is the international field. And in 3 years, when his mandate is over, President Macron is relatively young. Since the youngest French president is, you know, plausibly not going back to private banking. So all this bravado and those statements can be interpreted as an attempt to position himself as the leader of a new Europe with this strong on defense, with a nuclear power, and therefore Ukraine is perhaps a secondary matter for him, viewed from his political future and his relevancy in today French politics. That indeed could be the position of France, and again that doesn't help with with resolving the conflict. And it's actually seen as perceived as the French and Europe by extension, or some European countries who are part of that coalition of the wing, a step behind, because the Russians are, as Europe and as France is expressing that, bellicose and war-oriented policy. Russia is already at the negotiating table with the Americans in Saudi Arabia. So we're talking about, it's the irrelevancy of Europe. In fact, we're talking about fighting Russia, as Russia is on its way, rolling soon to be in the front of Strasbourg or Mountain. But Russia is actually at the negotiation table with America. And Ukraine is again not talking about peace after the blow up in the White House. So it's that seeming irrelevancy of Europe, and certainly not toward Europe that is strong in defense, where you could have a European head of state, as Macron would like to be. And it's also speak to the Macron positions and European positions over the last 3 years, so that first Russia is incapable, then Russia is about to roll through Europe. It speaks to
totally contradictory.
But also there's no indication that Russia, whether it has the capability or not, there's no indication that Russia wants to attack Europe. It comes from a distorted view of the origin of the conflict, that Russia is expanding, wants to rebuild. People should be threatened, Europeans should be threatened by Russia, that is imperialistic in going back to its Tsarism era. Why the essence of the conflict has not much to do with NATO, actually. NATO expansion is in the background, but it was the protection of the ethnic Russian population in Donbass that Russia, actually stated intervention of Russia in Ukraine in 2022 is the protection of the ethnic Russian, and Russia did not attack Ukraine to attack NATO. In other words, I mean, it was in the background, and it came as part of the resolution of the conflict package.
We do know that in December 2021, Putin sent to the US and to NATO a proposal to re-examine European security in that part of the world, in Eastern Europe, and specifically the Ukrainian situation. We know that he actually proposed that to Clinton as well. He proposed to at least define the relationship between Russia and NATO, to the extent that NATO was already expanding. So we know that there has been a discussion between the US and Russia for at least 30 years. And at the same time, we know that there was a specific overture to make decisions about how to avoid war in December and January of December 2021, January 22, and that that was a discussion basically between the US and Russia, which means that it should be easy for people to understand today why the resolution to the conflict would be determined more by the US and Russia than by Europe, which had no role to play in that, no active role to play. There's another question about Ukraine, which I want to ask you about, because this is something that people don't talk about. They don't talk about the logic of who's negotiating and why. But the other thing is what I read the article you did for American Conservative about your experience of the religious conflict within Ukrainian society, which I think people should read, because it tells another story that people have ignored, which is that there is a cultural clash inside Ukraine. And I don't know if you would call that a civil war or an element of civil war, but you certainly give the impression that it's serious and that it really divides the society. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Part of the tragedy for Ukrainian and the tragedy of our involvement in supporting Ukraine is that we didn't really help Ukraine in the sense that we didn't help heal the social tensions and division that, as you mentioned, is part of a broader cultural
But did we
divide.
even recognize it? Or didn't we refuse to recognize it?
Exactly. And it's fueled in part by or manifested by the crackdown on religious freedom that you mentioned. My article is about, and that has been what I witnessed in Ukraine is with the new church in Ukraine that is a nationalist
You
church.
have to explain that to the public. I don't know if they understand that
Yeah,
there are two churches. You did a discussion with Atul, which we published.
right, exactly. In very few words, you have a newer church that, with the support of the president of Ukraine, President Poroshenko, came to in existence, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which portray itself, which present itself as a nationalistic church. It replaced the liturgy language, for example, from Slavonic, which you can compare to Latin, the Catholic Church, with Ukrainian, modern Ukrainian, and that church, heavily supported by the government, created in part with the support of President Poroshenko, has been taking over through forced seizure of temples, the churches, the traditional church buildings, and which is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the mother of all Eastern Orthodox churches, born in 988 from Greek Byzance, and that conflict has only been exacerbated over the last 3 years, and so you have soldiers from the traditional church, which is the majority denomination in Ukraine, coming back from the front line only to see that to find that their church has been stolen from them. And that is but one manifestation of that social tension and social divide that we refuse, as you mentioned, Peter, to acknowledge. And we've certainly not been helping. And so these social divisions that, again, we have at the very best ignore, and if not exacerbated, is undermining the capability to fight, the will to fight. And this is something that Europe could have and maybe can in the future, if they really want to help Ukraine, is to help society stick together, help society heal divisions, keep Ukrainian society strong. And we've not been doing that. And in fact, it goes beyond the church. I met with lawyers who have worked in the last decades toward more transparency and accountability of the government watchdog roles. And they say, initially we received support from America to establish government watchdog bodies, and then that funding went away. Yes, we do receive a lot of military hardware, but we wish we could also receive civil society support to keep our government accountable, to have vibrant democratic institutions. So this has not happened, or it has been very marginally compared with the military hardware and sending Ukrainian, to war, to the front line. Even, again, many willingly do so, of course, they're very patriotic. But this imbalance ultimately is undermining Ukraine's ability to continue the fighting for its survival. And so that is conversations that we haven't had in Europe and in general in the West. It's like, how have we actually been helping Ukraine? Have we actually been helping Ukraine besides sending second grade, in large part obsolete military equipment to the countries? Haven't we contributed to the downfall of Ukraine, to the division within society?
Yeah, I wish more people had read your article, because it strikes me as curious. I'm not surprised that the media would ignore it, because it sends a message that contradicts the idea that Ukraine is a totally unified country in opposition to Russia. which is true at the political level, but at the cultural level, it's something totally different. So would you, in your experience of Ukraine, can you honestly say that it's even potentially a functioning democracy? We know it's now in a state of martial law. Elections were canceled, and obviously it's in a state of war. So you don't have the normal institutions you would expect functioning naturally. But if we were to have peace, do you see, from your experience, society coming together in any way and being constructive in the sense of being able to build and work together? Is that a reality we could envisage today?
Well, there are a lot of if, but I didn't spend enough time in Ukraine to be necessarily a fair observer, no pun intended. But from the information that I gathered from the pictures that I can put together, they indeed, as you mentioned, currently there is a martial law, but when you see the use of states, law enforcement agencies to go after the clergy, when you see the lack of due process in terms of expropriation of properties, in fact, you see something that has more to do with Ukraine, previous 100 years history prior to its independence, than what we see in vibrant modern democracies, if any can still claim that title. But and I will give you an anecdote. In my conversation with the traditional church clergy, I raised the question of their concern, how big were their concerns, anxiety, and fear that their buildings, their temples were being forcefully seized from them. And one of the archbishop looked at me and said, we've been through that during Stalin. And I think that speaks to what we would call the deep state. That's not to say that there is not a very active, vibrant, practically aspirationally democratic or fighting toward democracy Ukraine. I met them, as I mentioned, these public service oriented individuals who have built institutions like government watchdogs. They are there, but there is also the reality of the past and of the culture, and that is has been, in the case of the church, which is very significant in people's life in Ukraine, has been unleashed against, and these are not democratic practices, these are not democratic values. And in fact, it's not just me saying that. The UN has expressed concern over the restrictions on religious freedom, the criminal prosecutions of the clergy, legislative measures that could further restrict religious freedom, violence against the church, canceling the church. This is something that the UN, again, we have not paid attention to it in the media, but that's something the UN has repetitively raised, even during the war.
No, I think there's a reason why the media would not have covered it in the US, because the idea of separation of church and state is just fundamental, even though there are people now, Christian fundamentalists, who are hoping that the US and under Trump could evolve into a new theocratic state. But that's just so fundamental that people believe that it is absolutely unthinkable that the state could actually intervene in religion. That religion could intervene in the state, maybe Americans could accept, but that the state could intervene in religion would be considered to be totalitarianism. And of course, the whole point of American foreign policy is to oppose totalitarianism. Now, the other thing, from Europe's point of view, I think Europe has ignored it for another reason. Europe has become totally secular. Religions play absolutely no role in political decision making in Europe. So the European population has got to the point where they think, well, anything you talk about concerning religion, that can't be a real conflict because Nobody really cares. But in Ukraine, they do care, if I understand correctly. Would you say that?
Absolutely, and the even in the context of Europe that is more secular by the day, Ukraine cracked down on religious freedom, to use that as an illustration of the state of democracy, if you wish, and society in Ukraine. That would actually violate some of the core legislation, or the core requirements, excuse me, legal requirements, the Copenhagen principles,
Yeah.
to join the EU. So even in the EU that doesn't really care about, as you said, about religion, it would actually violate the European laws, and it would. Ukraine today, there is an argument to be made that doesn't meet the requirements in terms of separation of state and church, because of the state, or the influence of the state over church, of the restrictions. To be more specific, the restrictions of religious freedom, it would not accede, it would not become a member of the EU, because it violates those principles and those requirements. So
even the aspiration, we know about NATO and the problem of NATO because of Russia, because Russia considers it an existential threat. But even the question of Ukraine becoming part of the European Union, which was what provoked the demonstrations in 2013, that is a romantic notion that would even be possible, from what you're saying. Is that
on those
true? And given, I mean, you can always correct a situation which is even dystopian, but how correctable is it? How reasonable would it be to think that Ukraine could remodel itself in the way that would make it acceptable to the European Union?
Absolutely, and this is why why it's so puzzling that Europe rushes to make security arrangement with Ukraine, to talk about military, which is perfectly legitimate, one might say, but actually does not help Ukraine to become a European Union, or to meet the European Union standard, or to become a European Union democracy. We send that all the hardware, but we actually close our eyes on helping Ukraine to model itself, or to become closer, to build the institutional setup to actually become what we say it is, a democracy that is part of the club of European democracies. And it's these hypocrisies that we will use Ukraine militarily, but we actually will not help Ukraine, while claiming that we would welcome Ukraine. And I think that duplicity is running its course. And now there is this jusqu'au boutisme approach is showing its cracks. And I think the cracks will only show more, because what you can see from both American and Europe is that wave of right-wing parties, which in large part are anti-war parties. The AfD in Germany, Nigel Farage in the UK, the Rassemblement pour la France, Le Pen party in France, and the Meloni in Italy, which is also not distancing itself from sending troops in Ukraine. So these positions, these untenable positions of Europe will actually, likely run its course pretty quickly. And it's been 3 years that we've said that the right wing are coming to power, and it's not been that quick. But nonetheless, the rise of the right-wing governments will distance themselves, or let's call them sovereignist governments, is coming up, and that's a reaction. That's a reaction to the failed European policy to arm Ukraine, but actually not really caring about whether we're helping Ukraine or not.
Yeah, that's why I think if Europe persists in the way that Macron was indicating, this is actually going to stimulate voting for right-wing parties, And people will continue to ignore the fact that much of that vote is based on opposition to militarism. Everyone focuses on immigration as being the issue, but it isn't just immigration. And even immigration is a somewhat dicey issue. I mean, it's not clear what people mean when they say they're against immigration. I can understand that the US had a strategy for weakening Russia, which is what Lloyd Austin said very early in the conflict, that it wasn't really about Ukraine, but it was really about the need to weaken Russia. What I don't understand, and maybe you can help me, is why and how Europe could think that they can weaken Russia and that it's good for them to weaken Russia. Does that make any sense at all? I mean, they're not saying it, but as that seemed to be the real motivation that was behind the US engagement with Ukraine, I would suppose that if there's some continuity on the European side with prolonging the war, that it would imply realizing that vision of weakening Russia. So what is Europe's relationship with Russia? What can it be and what will it be?
It's a great question, and that may mean different things to different European countries. I mean, we see Germany and the rise of the AfD is in part a reaction to deindustrialization because of the lack of cheap energy that Russia provided. So certainly for Germany and therefore Europe, because Germany is the powerhouse, industrial powerhouse of Europe, that means that war is not going to be sustainable, and parties like the AfD will come to power and come back to sort of that working equilibrium that Germany had with Russia and before that the Soviet Union since Second World War. It's fundamentally for France. As Hélène Carrère-Dancos, she passed away last year. She was the secretary of the French Academy, described in her book, De Gaulle and Russia. De Gaulle called Russia the flank ally, l'allié de revers, that we need Russia if we are in a conflict with Germany, right? And so strategically, Russia and France, although the relations have had up and downs, but it is an ally. If there used to be another conflict in Europe that would put Germany and France against each other, which sounds maybe a fantasy today, but it happened twice last century. Let's not forget that. It was not too long ago. And another consideration is, I think those European countries those European leaders quickly jump into a conflict that they've been personally, for whatever reason, they were sold, whether it's following the Americans or they thought it would be a quick gains in terms of foreign policy and improve their standing. But now they are personally deeply invested into that conflict. And it's very hard to extract themselves when they have made so many definitive statements. While again, for America, it's somehow easier because Trump can say, well, again, this is not my war. I'm here to get out. It's much less easy for European leaders to say that after they have personally invested so much political capital, so much resources, to say, look, I mean, we were wrong, we failed, we could not undermine Russia strategically, we couldn't strategically defeat Russia, we made a mistake, let's not, turn the page. It's much harder for Europe to do that than for America.
Yeah, they're in a very difficult position because if they admit that they should rethink the whole thing, they will be admitting that they were simply following the US and really stupidly following the US in the first commitment. And then the US changes because Trump comes in. If they were to change their position today, they would be accused of just stupidly following a different president. And that's the most humiliating thing you could think of. So that demonstrates the the absurdity of the situation today, and which I think is really coming to a head here in Europe. I think we haven't seen yet what's going to happen at the level of popular reaction, because we don't know what decisions are going to be made, what events may occur. I don't think there will be any dramatic events, but there will be redefinitions of position in the coming months. And people are very confused. I'm really curious to see how the average European in different European countries is going to react. It's going to be interesting.
Absolutely. And for the sake of Ukraine, I mean, the data shows now by the UN that Ukraine has one of the lowest birth rate in the world, about 1 child per woman, which is way below the minimum 2.1 child per woman.
They've lost 30% of their population or something like that.
They already lost about 10 million out of 35 millions population. They lost 10 millions from independence in 91 to the beginning of the war because of the lack of opportunities, corruption. And they lost another 6.5 million who left the country since February 22, plus no numbers are around close to 1 million, certainly hundreds of thousands dead and crippled. Now with one of the lowest birth rate in the world, 1 child, which is way below the replacement rate of 2.5 children per woman. So it's for the sake of Ukraine. We will more.
Yeah. So Flavius, you're an expert in conflict resolution. What could we possibly imagine as a way of moving towards resolution in Europe in general, not just Ukraine? Ukraine is one part of it, and I think that might be the easiest one to solve. But given the confusion we've been talking about in Europe, I'm really curious to know how Europe is going to come out of this.
Well,
and is there a way of addressing it in terms of conflict resolution?
That's certainly beyond my paycheck, and the paycheck of an independent journalist is already very low. That said, there is one small section of a documentary that was released shortly after the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. It's called Un Président, l'Europe et la guerre, a President, Europe and War. And it's essentially télé-réalité, cinéma vérité, where you have the documentarist, a camera following Macron, play by play, day by day, in its last-ditch effort to prevent the war. And it was put together as a way to flatter Macron ego and to show him as a chef de guerre, as a war chief. But in fact, that's not part of my answers here. But in fact, it shows him as someone who's largely ignorant about what's at stake and what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia. But anyhow, in that documentary, there is one part where he's on his way to Kiev. So he's driving from the Élysée Palace to the train station to take the train to Kiev and meet with President Zelensky. And after that meeting, he went to Russia. And he turned to the cameraman and he said, it's one of those truths that comes spontaneously. He said, the big problem, and I'm perhaps not paraphrasing very 100%, but the idea is, one of the big issue behind that is that we haven't been able to include Russia into a redesign security arrangement in Europe after the Second World War. The Warsaw Pact, which was the Eastern Bloc military pact, ended willingly by the Soviet Union, so by Moscow. We kept NATO, but we haven't been able to rethink and to bring Russia into a European security arrangement. And that's certainly a large part of the resolution of the problem. Another element is
Russia is a European country. That's
right. As much as the media portrayed Russia the last 3 years as an Asian country, yes, the majority of its landmass is in Asia, but the majority of its population is in Europe.
And it's culture. It's part of European culture. It always has been.
Absolutely, and so is Ukraine, and that's the tragedy. I mean, both,
Yeah.
both European countries. And another questions that's at the heart of the Russian concern is the plight and the situation of the ethnic Russians outside Russia. I mean, we very often quote President Putin in his remark that the greatest disaster or tragedy of the 20th century is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then we extrapolate that, he regrets, he wants to reestablish the Soviet Union. But in fact, we don't quote the second part of his sentence, which is because overnight, millions of Russians found themselves without a home state.
Yeah.
And so there is indeed, is it Estonia, one of the Baltic states, stripped its ethnic Russians from their citizenships? Their citizenship. There is it doesn't justify war crimes, it doesn't justify Russian invasion, but there is the reality of millions of ethnic Russians who are at risk, who have been victimized in these overnight new countries. And they haven't been asked their opinion on that. And again, you don't want to arbitrate here, litigate whether they should be or should not be in those countries. But the fact is there is a concern by Russian over how ethnic Russians are being treated abroad. And that's in large part the cause of the war, or a significant part of the cause of the war is like ethnic Russians in Ukraine were being marginalized. And it's not only ethnic Russians, it's also ethnic Hungarian, ethnic Romanians. In fact, Hungary brought to the European Commission complaints about the way that the Ukrainian state was treating its ethnic minorities. No, to be fair, I entered Ukraine via Romania, and I stayed. The first part of my choice was in Chernice, which is in large part ethnic Romanian, excuse me. And from what I witnessed, they were very happy to be Ukrainians. I stayed with the family the husband speaks Russian, the wife speaks Romanian, and they speak Ukrainian at home and to their kids, and they're very happy. And the kids go to a Romanian-speaking school, and they were very happy, very patriotic. And they say, we recently received a visit from the consul of Romania to the school. So, again, at its best, Ukraine is a giant Switzerland. And with these different components, ethnic components. And have we helped Ukraine preserve that? Have we helped Ukraine, maintain that harmony, maintain that richness? I'm not so sure that's what we've been doing the last 3 years, the last 10 years since Ukraine independence, in fact.
As I say, I'm very concerned personally about how things will evolve in Europe, how politically and socially and economically we can maintain our society. A lot of Europeans are thinking that way. We've had this wonderful, fairly generous system that has given a lot of sense of security to citizens, and now people feel that it's under threat, or they're wondering whether it is under threat. So that's a question I'd like to keep following up to see how it's evolving. And I'll just ask you one last question. What's happening in Syria? That'll be for another conversation.
I think it's still unfolding. Somehow it was predictable. HTS, the militia that took control, or the largest militia group that's part of the power that took control of Syria in December. The head of that group is the president, Al-Jolani, was actually on the terror list.
Yeah, ISIS.
And exactly, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So somehow this was expected. The violence was expected. With regards to the last bout of violence against civilians that happened this weekend, what is regrettable perhaps is that the EU issued a statement on X blaming the deposed President al-Assad. However, the information we have that actually this violence was taped on video by the perpetrators with are part of the HCS coalition wearing those ISIS patches. And the US, for once, one can say, actually issued a statement that clearly said, well, this violence has to stop, and called for Security Council meeting. It's regrettable that the EU was not able again to live up to its responsibilities.
Listen, we come back to the same problem, the confusion in the EU.
Yes.
And which is an existential problem now for Europeans.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
We'll end on that note, which means we'll have plenty of things to talk about in future conversations. And thank you very much, Flavius, for being with us.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.